In this presentation, we're going to take a look at the typological approach, which was one of the earliest ways of looking at social change in the social sciences. In order to understand the typological approach, it's important to take a look at the historical context under which it was developed. And that requires us to take a look at the global trend towards urbanization. And we see that the global human population has been getting increasingly urban really for several centuries, but it became a predominantly urban planet around 2008 when the global urban population surpassed the global rural population. And so we can call this the global urban transition, and it's driven by a number of social and economic processes. And the results of urbanization are quite significant for social life, for political life, for the economy, for culture, and for the environment. And the typological approach can help us understand and grapple with some of these changes. To a large degree, the typological approach began with the work of Ferdinand Tönnies, who wrote a book called Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, which is translated to mean community and society. And in this book, Tönnies discusses what life is like in these extreme situations of pure Gemeinschaft or pure Gesellschaft, which he says are characterized by the rational will versus the natural will. And in community life, it's the natural will, which really speaks to the social nature of human beings and the desire to connect with one another and live in more collective or communal situations. And in cities, we see a transition to a rational will, where instead of being social, people are more transactional with one another. Relationships are a means to an end rather than an end in themselves, and it tends to be a more individualistic experience. And so these are the extreme polar opposites that characterize community and urban life. And from this was the birth of the typological approach. Émile Durkheim, who's considered one of the pioneers of sociology, wrote a book called The Division of Labor in Society, which was based on his PhD dissertation, and really provided a foundation for most of his additional work throughout his career. And in that work, we see two important concepts that fit within this discussion of typological comparisons, and that is mechanical solidarity versus organic solidarity. And essentially, this is the difference between sameness and difference. And solidarity based on sameness is what we see in more communal style living, which is more closely associated with rural life. And organic solidarity has to do with the variety of occupations that complement each other, and these tend to be more associated with urban life and city living. Max Weber was a colleague of Ferdinand Tönnies in German sociology, and in his work we see a number of typological comparisons that are quite similar to the ideas that Tönnies put forward. For instance, Weber is best known for his work on bureaucracy, and he offered, for example, comparisons of bureaucratic versus personalistic organizations. He also studied associative versus communal relationships, and in those discussions we can see similarities to the natural will and the rational will that Tönnies discussed. And finally, in his examination of leadership styles, we could see a parallel in his comparison of traditional versus rational legal leaders, where the traditional leader is based on the natural will, if we were to use Tönnies' language, and rational legal leaders are based on the rational will. And Georg Simmel was also a German sociologist who communicated with Weber and Tönnies and wrote a particularly provoking essay called The Metropolis in Mental Life. And within that essay you can see a number of typological comparisons where he's looking at what it's like to live in an urban setting where there's impersonality, and the blasé attitude, and Simmel makes implicit comparisons to rural communal life, which he actually did not paint in a nostalgic light, and he actually suggested that the life in rural communities tended to stifle individualism because of their communal focus. So again, we see some parallels here to the ideas of rational versus natural will, or Weber's personalistic versus bureaucratic ideas. So if we consider the contributions of these early social science forefathers, I guess, if you want to call them that, they had a shared concern with impersonality and rationality and the calculating nature of living in urban areas, in urban life. They were also concerned with what it would mean to lose the kind of life that existed in rural communities, and which are characterized by sameness, shared values, norms, and beliefs. Remember Durkheim's notion of mechanical solidarity, and that was breaking down and gave rise to what he called a condition of anomie, or normlessness. But in all of these concerns, we also see some hopefulness, and that is in what urbanization can offer, urban development, in terms of promoting a diverse society, protecting individuals from collective suppression, and so forth. So much of what we think of and associate with the typological approach is more or less the classical theoretical body of social science and sociology in particular. But we still see some contemporary relevance to this perspective today, and to a large extent that has taken the shape of rural and urban comparisons. And in fact, we still continue to see many of their concerns hold relevance, and rural and urban areas both face a special set of challenges, and they must deal with the unique impacts of globalization, problems of sustainability, and adaptation to an increasingly diverse population. And to this day, we continue to see important differences in rural and urban areas, each occupying different geographic ends of the spectrum, and a lot of the outcomes are tied to simple population size and density, though not everything that separates them can be reduced to that. And we see, for instance, different patterns of social interaction, different styles of culture, different political and economic realities, and especially different environmental conditions between urban and rural areas. In the United States, rural areas and rural people account for about 1/5 of the population. Those counties categorized as non-metropolitan are divided into predominantly non-core counties, which are the most rural, and micropolitan counties, which may actually start to look like small cities. And the most recent census showed that non-core counties were losing population, and was less of a pattern with micropolitan areas, but generally we continue to see a process of urbanization unfolding, much like the early social scientists did in Europe. And globalization has meant a lot of changes for urban and rural areas, but scholars like Richard Florida suggest that the type of jobs that are currently favored, those in the creative class, are going to leave rural areas behind, and as traditional ways of rural life have been crumbling for some time, such as agriculture and energy development, this raises a number of concerns for rural people. Interestingly, if we look at rural areas in the United States, we can observe that most of the jobs are now in the service sector, although they're not the higher level service sector jobs of the creative class. And when we compare non-core to micropolitan areas, we only see a small difference, although the micropolitan areas are more likely to have the creative class jobs. There's also been a major upswing in self-employment, probably due largely to the decline of traditional rural employment. But average pay in this self-employment world is about half that of the metropolitan counterparts, and so we see some inequalities here, some disparities. Compared to metropolitan areas, workers in micropolitan areas only make about 71%, and while non-core workers make about 66% of their metropolitan counterparts. And almost a third of metropolitan populations have a college degree that's 4-year, while only about half that, 1 in 7 of non-core and about 1 in 5 of micropolitan residents have that much education. Furthermore, about 2/3 of the poorest county in the U.S. are non-core rural, non-metropolitan places, a quarter are micropolitan, and only 13% are metropolitan. So poverty is very much a rural issue. Urban areas have their own sets of challenges. Many of these related to racial conflict and inequalities that have long persisted over several decades and have given rise to continued tension and conflict. And we can see, for instance, that the conflict approach to community development was born out of this kind of dynamic, where Saul Alinsky organized ethnic groups to confront their oppression and create changes. And we continue to recognize that progress can only be made in urban areas when minority residents are involved in the community development process. So in sum, the typological approach remains relevant as we continue to see urbanization unfold with all of its different impacts and challenges, and urban and rural communities are each saddled with their own set of related and interrelated problems.